Hello and welcome back to the Toolbox project. In this video, we are going to get the lid hinged, but not in the traditional way. I'll explain a bit more in a minute. Let's get going. So I've got a couple of samples here to go through regarding hinging the lid, because this is a tricky process to figure out with regards to big boxes like this or small jewellery boxes, whether you've got a heavy lid, whether you've got a light lid, whether you've got things you want to mount inside. A common problem with them, at least in the design stage, is how do we make that lid stop, like we've done with this one and also with this one. You see, they both stop at the perfect angle, they don't swing shut, they don't swing open and end up ripping the hinges out. And we're going to be doing this using these cheap hinges that I've just picked up from a DIY supplier this morning. They cost about £2 a pair. There's no inbuilt stop in them, they swing completely freely. Nothing about these hinges will allow the lid to stop like it's done in these two examples. It's all about the installation. But let's go through this one first. So this is one way of doing it, and these are specialist hinges from a company called Brusso. They are absolutely gorgeous, all made in the US, and they're actually installed on the router table, or you can do it with an overhead router as well with a certain jig. The issue, however, in this design is that along here we've got a little bit of short grain, and I managed to keep it on in this example, but when I've seen people install them in the past, that little end has popped off and you've had to glue it back on, and you sometimes end up with a little bit of a glue line along the end grain. They also cost quite a lot of money because they are just so well machined, and there is of course various iterations of this as well, some much higher quality such as the Smart Hinge by Andrew Crawford, and then you get some, cheaper knockoffs of them which aren't always good. But these have an inbuilt stop on the knuckles, and apart from the trade-offs of the price and also this end grain, they work very well and they look very nice. They're also quite easy to install once you get the router table set up. But next I want to show you this one. And so this is the installation we're going to go for with these cheaper hinges. And I will just say that this is somewhat of a work in progress at the moment. These hinges are yet to be cleaned up and I need to change the screws to something that, oh, they're actually mismatched as well. You've got a posi drive and then a Torx head there. Oops. But anyway, these hinges are yet to be cleaned up. This is actually a pair I've already done and what we're going to be installing in the oak toolbox I'm currently working on. And of course, I've got to do a little bit of flushing around the edges. But the thing to note with this is, these are exactly the same hinges as what I've got here, but the lid stops when it opens. And the way we've been able to achieve this is by ensuring that the knuckle itself is flush with the outside of the box. You then plane a little chamfer on that inside edge to not only blend it in somewhat, but act as a stop for when the lid opens. This is different to when you install hinges on doors, for example, where you make the pivot point of the knuckle flush with the outside of the cabinet. And in doing so, that allows the door to open 180 degrees. And this is an installation I've demonstrated in previous videos, and so that will be linked below should you be interested. And so, of course, it's up to you if you want the lid to stop at just over 90 degrees or do a full 180. I'll be demonstrating the former method in this by making it stop just over 90 degrees. It is worth saying at this point, if you let it swing to a full 180 degrees and you let the lid rest like that, particularly in this design where that lid's quite heavy, it puts a lot of leverage on the hinges themselves, especially if they're quite cheap ones. And it might not break them initially, but it's not going to do them any favors over the long term, especially if you let that lid drop. I've seen that happen and it's not a nice sight. In fact, it wasn't the hinges that broke, it ended up ripping off this entire bottom section of the lid because, it wasn't effectively glued on the corners and all that, but what I'm saying is it essentially puts a lot of shock not only on the hinges, but on the joints themselves. But by making it stop as close to 90 degrees as possible, you are minimizing that leverage and potential damage. Anyway, moving on to the actual subject of the video. How do we get these installed? Well, the key initially is in the preparation. Firstly, you need to be absolutely certain that that lid is sitting flat on the box carcass, no rocking from corner to corner. It's all flat, all the edges mate together well. You need to make sure that's in good standing. Secondly, it's in the preparation of the hinges themselves, and I've done an entire video showing you how to do this. Essentially, it shows you how to file the edges to be perfectly flat, the sides perfectly square, and how to clean it up so that it actually looks nicer than those ones that I showed you previously. Because although we can make these work, they are still £2 hinges and they are not going to be perfect out the bag. And so before you do this step, make sure to watch that video and get your hinges tuned properly. It'll be linked below. So whether you choose to install the hinges in the lid or the carcass first doesn't really matter, in my experience at least. I'm sure there's arguments for both, but I tend to start with the lid. So the first thing to make sure is, of course, check that you've got the lid on the correct way. And if you're struggling to read the grain continuity and stuff on the front, have a look at the end grain. That's usually the best indicator as to whether you've got it round the right way or not. Once you have established it, pick which side you want to be the front, or I guess the back in this case, because that's where it's going to be hinged. I'm choosing here. Open it to be flat like this, and just put a little triangle going across both the lid and the box. I find that the easiest way to get things located again. So first we need to work out how far in we want the hinges to go. Usually I do it about 30 millimeters from both the edges. You can do 3 hinges if you want, no reason why not. But I'm going to go in about 30 millimeters from either side, and I'm going to start that by squaring a knife line at that distance. And do this relatively light for now. Don't start digging it in too much because we're not necessarily going to be cutting all the way to this inside edge. There might be a little lip at the front. Next, you want to start working out which leaf goes where. You've got 4 options for this. You've got that leaf, and then you've obviously got the leaves on the other hinge, so it's important that we label these accurately. Secondly, the orientation of them matters as well. Not so much with these ones because we have an even number of knuckles. In this case, there's 6. But if you have an uneven number of them, let's say 5, you want the leaf with 2 prongs sticking out of it attached to the lid. The one with 3 prongs should be attached to the carcass. I can't vouch for the strength that gives. I've just heard it's good practice. But in the case of this, it doesn't really matter. It's even, whichever way I do it, it's exactly the same. But on the back of this, I'm going to get my knife and I'm going to scratch A into it. All right, and then we'll end up chopping it out, but I'll put an A on here as well. Now this is the somewhat tricky bit because we want to get the exact width of this hinge marked on the other side. And the way I tend to do this is I put my knife into that line that we scratched at 30 millimeters. You then put a square up against it to hit the side of that knife. You take the knife away, find the corresponding leaf, put that up against the square, hold it in position, take away the square, and then mark the other side, just with a little mark for now. Then once you can see it, you extend it. Again, do this lightly for now. We'll deepen them later. And so just to run through that again, because I know it's a bit weird, you put the knife into the mark, slide this square up to it. That means that that square is now locked in the exact same position where that line is. You then use that square as your stop for the hinge. You take the square away because you need your second hand, and then you mark the other side of it. That way you can be absolutely certain that those knives are the exact same width as this. So we're going to do that the other way now. Going to scratch B onto this leaf. Okay, and I'm going to have to flip this round to make sure I'm still using my dominant hand. So knife goes in the mark. Square slides up to it, stops it in position, hold it, find the correct leaf, place that down, take away the square, don't let it move, square that across. It's the same technique I use when I'm cutting cross-halving joints and things. It's really good for nesting one component into the other. And I'll just put a little B next to that. So when I'm hinging doors on cabinets and things, what I'll often do is continue this marking out process, doing the techniques I'm about to show you, chop out the socket, get the hinge fixed, and then use that hinge itself to trace around onto the carcass. That's a good way of doing cabinets. But in this case with the box, where we've got the lid resting on top of the carcass, we can actually do most of the marking out now before chopping anything out, and I find that to be a little bit more accurate and easier. So with those 4 lines I've scratched to indicate the width of the hinge, you'll probably struggle to see them on camera because I have done them quite light, but we're going to transfer those round the corner of this component just by putting the knife into the mark and then cutting a little bit deeper. That way we can see where that line is, but looking at this edge. You then get that lid placed on the box in the orientation it should be. Use a triangle to do that. Flip it over onto its front, and what you should be able to see is the 2 marks from that lid. We've got one there and we've got another one here. You can, of course, transfer the marks across like that, but in this case, I just want to use a bit of alignment first, just to make sure those edges stay flush with one another. And we're just going to very carefully transfer those marks to the carcass. Then with those marks transferred, flip the carcass upright again, and then do exactly what we did on the lid and scribe those lines in. Again, I usually find that putting the knife into the existing knife mark and sliding the square up to it is usually the easiest. And very lightly mark it for now. Some of these hinges on the remaining leaves, we are going to scratch C and D. So then just reorientate your triangle, and then we know that B is attaching to D. So I'm going to put D there, A is attaching to C. And also just do a sanity check at this point and make sure those lines do actually line up on the inside faces. And also get the hinge with the corresponding letter and check there's no anomalies with those lines. Always good to do sanity checks with these before cutting them out. Cool, so we've got the hinges positioned on the width of the box. Now we just need to work out how far in they go. And so for this, you're going to set the marking gauge to be the entire height of the hinge itself. And then with that setting, you're going to scratch between those 2 lines we have knifed in previously. Now you can see with this is very close to that inside edge, very close. Probably about millimeter away. This of course depends on the size of the hinges you've got and the thickness of the sides, and it's up to you if you want to try and retain that inner wall. I'm going to give it a go on this, but if it starts splintering off and looks quite weak, I'll just end up removing it and I'll blend in the hinge somehow later. I'll say that it's getting very close on this one. No, I think I'm going to be chopping all the way through. Okay, and then finally we need to establish how far in the hinges are going this way. There is a couple of ways of doing this, and unfortunately this is the trade-off with these cheap hinges, in that when they close, there is a gap between the leaves, which means that if we set the marking gauge to be the exact thickness of one of these leaves, that gap is then going to be transferred across the entire width of the back. Now, is that a problem in this case? Well, not necessarily on this box. Because we're doing the method of installing the hinge really deep in the carcass to provide that locking motion, and of course we're having to plane a chamfer to act as that stop, that gap we're going to be seeing at the back of the box will not only be at the back of the box, so not too important, but also it's going to be hidden within a chamfer. And so on boxes where you're not going to have the advantage of that chamfer, this is something you'll need to consider. And if you're not entirely sure on what I'm talking about, this whole concept is explained in a previous video I did on installing hinges, which is the follow-up video on the tutorial on how to tune these up. Worth watching that if you want to understand what that gap's all about and why it's actually useful in some instances. Anyway, in this case, we're going to set the marking gauge to be the thickness of one of the leaves. And so then that setting gets scribed up the outside of the box between each of those marks that we scratched on the corners earlier. Then because I've now established I'm going to be going all the way through with these hinges, I'm going to scratch that mark on the inside face as well. And that's going to, of course, be on both the lid and the carcass. So you've got a couple of options now as far as this tutorial goes with regards to installing these hinges. If, like me, you've established that you're going to need to cut through the entire width of the box, continue watching this video. We'll go through that process step by step. If, however, you've marked the depth and you've found out that you do have an inside wall that you can retain, the video I referenced just now about installing hinges will be linked below, and that will show you exactly how to do that. Overall, it's the same concept, but there are subtle differences here and there that will affect the overall fit. And so be sure to watch the video that is right for you in this moment. So first I'm going to go over and deepen those knife lines that I scratched in originally. We know they're in the right position now, and we know we need to cut all the way through, so I might as well just square across the whole thing. They don't need to be too deep either, just enough to comfortably get a chisel into. Okay, so in terms of tool selection for this, firstly, a chisel. And in this case, I've chosen one that is wider than the thickness of this side, because of course I'm cutting all the way through. If you're not, then you don't necessarily need to stick with this. You'll also need a mallet, and that's about it. Something to clamp it down. You definitely need that. You can, of course, use routers and stuff to flatten out the bottom, which is certainly a good and accurate method of clearing these out, but that does also involve making some sort of jig or platform to surround this to make sure that router is properly supported. By the time I've done that, I could have just chopped it out with a chisel, so I tend to stick with these. So the way I like to do this is start bang on in the middle of the socket. And we're going to do a series of small chops going just shy of the line here and just shy of the line here. And those chops are usually spaced about 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters apart or something like that. And of course, when we do it, make sure you're not hitting it hard enough to go below that line that we've scratched down the inside and outside in this case. Okay, so I've stopped about 2 millimeters shy of the outside lines, and I'm just going to work into the middle now. Looks like I need another clamp, making sure not to go below those lines on the outside. Okay, so that's probably dug me down enough to go into the line on the side now. And if those fibres aren't separating very easy, you can of course sever it at either side first, just to cut it a little bit deeper, and that'll make them pop out a lot better. Okay, so that's looking good, and you see I still haven't gone to the sides yet. We're going to finish those up with a final couple of chops once we've cleared out this waste in the middle. Okay, so I've now flipped it round. I'm going to come in from the other side. You can see, however, that my handle isn't quite able to fit within the lid of the box. With these chisels, I have the advantage of being able to take these handles off and get in like that. But if you aren't able to do this, you can, of course, just flip the chisel over and do it beveled down instead. And when it comes to these edges, you chop it out exactly as you would do with dovetails, where you just keep halving the material until you get up to that line. So I've definitely got a bit of a bump or something going on here. So I'll just check all the way along it with an engineer's square, see if I can find anything that's sitting high. Definitely something around there. The key with this is just to constantly check the fit of the hinges as you go. The other thing you can do is also scribble a little bit of pencil on the bottom of the hinge, put that into the socket, rub it back and forth a bit, and you'll see where those high points are. Before you do that, just check that the hinge itself isn't bowing along its length though. This one does have a little bit of that going on, so I had to be quite careful with it. So I'm going to repeat that for the remaining 3 sockets and meet you on the other side when we're going to start drilling the holes for the screws. Okay, so of course the next difficulty we have is the positioning of the hinge front to back. When you've got an inside wall there, it's quite easy because it just pushes into a corner, but because we're lacking it in this case, we've got that front to back movement we want to eliminate. So I've cut a strip that is the exact height of the inside wall, and we're going to use that as something to work against to ensure that this hinge is flush with the inside face after assembly. We're then going to use an awl to mark the location of the center of these holes. And again, because it's lacking that back wall, you want these to be absolutely spot on in the center. If they're slightly off, it's going to pull the hinge one way or the other. Okay, and then when we're happy with that, find a drill bit that matches the shank size of the screw. And by the way, there will be a video below showing you how to accurately choose a pilot and clearance hole for a screw. And because I'm using brass screws for this that have a high chance of shearing the head, I'm going to coat them in a bit of candle wax first while we screw them in. Another thing you can do is pre-tap them using a steel screw and then screw these in afterwards using that thread, but I don't actually have one that matches this pitch. Right, so I've got the hinges in position, and if we try and place that in the box, you'll see that I'm not actually able to get it all the way to that front edge. And that is because, of course, we've set these hinges to be too deep and it's beginning to bind on the back edge here, which is exactly what we want. So it's at this point we're going to have to start planing the chamfer on the back of the lid and the back of the box. Now, my experience with this step is that it takes a lot less than you would expect to get that lid to bind at the correct angle. So make sure to check it frequently. I only tend to install the middle screw when I'm doing this, just because I'm constantly removing them, then putting them back in every time I check it. So literally just do a couple of strokes at a time, then check it, because you'll find that the changes you make will get exponentially more the closer you get to the desired angle. There is just a tiny amount to take off. If I put this just below 90 degrees, it reaches the inside edge. As soon as I open it to 90 degrees, it starts pulling it away slightly. I've now put all 3 screws in the hinges here, and I'm just going to do the adjustment on the top of the box itself. So I don't want to push this much further than that. I want to focus on getting them fixed into the box now, so then we can properly check it while it's all in situ. So for that, I'm going to mark the location of the holes using a pencil first, and then I can come back with the awl afterwards and properly mark them. See, this is why it's worth constantly checking, because it takes a lot less than you think. It is successfully hinged. It stops at a very nice place. The only thing I have got is some very minor misalignment. There's a little step going from the carcass to the lid here, and then it obviously drops off on the other side. So that means the lid needs to be shifted this way a little bit. And I actually do these movements when I'm trying to figure it out. It's like, right, it needs to be shifted that way. And so if I flick it upright, it needs to be shifted that way. So either this side needs to dip down or this side lift up. That also means this is moving back, which means that that bottom one could also be shifted back as well. So we got a few different movements we could do with this. I did kind of expect this, having an open socket, both the front and back. Obviously having no proper corner to lock into will inevitably result in some misalignment. So let's start on that next, shall we? Damn it! Now the best way I find to diagnose and fix problems like this is to work sequentially through each of the leaves. What I'll do is loosen all 3 screws on one leaf, close the lid, see if that fixes anything. If not, tighten them back up, try it on another one. And basically go through all 4 leaves and seeing if one of those screws, or maybe 2, 3 of those screws, is pulling this lid slightly one way or the other or something like that. So I'm going to try that first. If it doesn't work, we'll have to do a different method. So I've just loosened hinge A, and I'm able to do this front to back movement. And in doing so, it pulls that front edge in. So hinge A, or leaf A should I say, is the problem. So leaf A is this top one attached to the lid. It's the first one I did conveniently. And so now I'm going to see if I can establish which is the offending screw within that leaf. And I'll do that by taking one out at a time and see if it fixes itself. There might be 2 offending screws, of course, but we'll just check this one by one. Ha-ha! That one. That fixed it straight away.
You little
So it's this one on the left, and what it'll be is it's been piloted slightly off center, and therefore it's either pulling this hinge up or pushing it down or something like that, therefore throwing the whole lid out of alignment. So firstly I'm going to mark it so I actually fix the right one here, and then detach the lid. So I'm actually going to plug these holes and re-drill them, and this is where it's quite nice having a stock of 3mm dowels in your workshop. However, I don't have any here, so what I'm going to resort to doing is whittling down a plug out of a scrap piece of oak, and then we're going to stick that in there, glue it in, and re-drill the holes afterwards. So I've started with a very, very small piece of oak here, and we're just going to take those corners off and try and make it somewhat round. When doing stuff like this, it's always important to work away from you, and I actually push the blade with my thumb. When I do it, you get a lot of control that way. I'm going to peel away the outside until we get it down to the right diameter. And there's no harm in having a bit of a taper on this as well. It's usually what ends up happening anyway. Now bear in mind at the moment these do have candle wax in them to cut down on that friction, so I'm just going to drill that out. That's quite a good fit we got there. Bit of glue. And if you've got some snips or something, you might be able to get that off. And then using that same trick we did with the dovetails before, you can kind of mushroom the rest of it out. Peel away that excess, and that's it plugged. So I'm going to get that existing screw fixed in position, so I'm happy with the placement of that. Okay, and just like that, the lid is hinged. So as you can see at the moment, they looked a little bit grubby. They've got candle wax on them, they've got finger grubbiness on them. The screw heads themselves haven't been polished to match the hinges, and we haven't clocked the screws either, so they're all pointing in the same direction. That's something that's up to you. I don't always tend to do it, but all those minor details and cleanup we'll do towards the end of the project. No point doing it now because there might be instances we need to take the lid off again in order to clean and sand things later. So don't worry about any of that grubbiness now. As long as your lid sits on there straight, it stops at the right angle, you're all good. And so with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next lesson.